whenever anyone gives a climate talk these days, there's a process of worrying about whether you're being too negative. And I was just handed a get-out-of-jail-free card about 20 minutes ago. My mother, Cindy Iutzi, is here, retired journalist and farmer. And she handed me a note while Bill McKibben was talking, and it says, "Ultimately, the Earth will be okay. It will regenerate, but it may require removal of humankind." And in case it wasn't clear, she then labeled it "My words of comfort." So I can proceed with confidence now that I'm not going to be too negative. So I started with some paradoxes yesterday, and a key one was, do we need fast responses? We need fast responses, but we also need slow, transformative responses. And I hope by this time we've seen that we can support both of the arms of that paradox. We need fast action, and we need fast action on slow solutions. So it's undeniable that we have the possibility of fast action on reducing and drawing down, ultimately to zero, our carbon emissions from fossil fuels. You can call a framework for that a Green New Deal. You can call it a conservatism that actually focuses on conservation. You can call it a transition to an ecological civilization. But you have options. This can start at the national, the state, the local, or the affinity group level. Of course, it has to end national and global. It can start anywhere from there. It can come from the left. It can come from the right. It can come from some kind of a weird four-dimensional political hypercube, right? It doesn't matter. We need to do it. It has to be broad. Wherever it comes from, it has to be broad, it has to be ambitious, and it has to be assured. One framework that we're thinking about these days is something called Cap and Adapt that was proposed by our own Stan Cox here, along with Larry Edwards. It features a managed ramp down and phase out, ultimately to zero, of fossil fuel use, including, critically, a hard and steadily declining cap on fossil fuel emissions. Not some kind of a scheme where we're going to trade our way to it, but a hard and steadily declining cap. That's the cap part. The adapt part is a national economic mobilization, ultimately a global one, to build out the maximum viable renewable energy and energy efficiency infrastructure. And per Amory, I'll add the mental infrastructure, the design choices that we can make, build all of that out mentally and physically, but then we'll be required to reach beyond implementing these technological approaches to energy conservation and implement cultural transition from a mindset of luxury consumption of energy to a mindset of sufficiency. And then our renewable and efficiency approaches can rendezvous with our sufficient energy consumption. An approach like this can be tailored to any timeline. Maybe the most important thing is that it's a hard timeline, but as important, it needs to be a quick one. We have to remember that every month, every year, every hour that we delay has an increasing cost in broken lives and broken ecosystems. 2030 seems to sound awfully fast to a lot of people. I guarantee you that it doesn't sound fast to people's homes that are going underwater. So maybe we think about a 2030 timeline for a 100% phase out. This will require movement of policy levers at the highest level, but what history tells us is that nothing like this ever starts there. It starts, what history tells us, with civic mobilization. And I'm using the word civic somewhat intentionally here. I could say popular mobilization, that's a great phrase. But civic reminds us that civics does not just consist of running the jail. Civics sometimes includes going to jail. Right? We need a mobilization to spark policy change if it's going to happen. We're going to have to stick together in that mobilization. We need to ally with and draw on the wisdom of people in the global south, ally with and draw on the wisdom of minority and indigenous communities in our own country. And we even, and Sarah Smarsh dropped by here on Friday night, author of an excellent book called Heartland, we even need to ally and draw on the wisdom of people that don't fit in our stereotypes of allies, no matter what side of the red or blue divide that they're on. So we know that even though it's not going to be easy, we know that it's undeniably within our power, if we choose to wield that power, to achieve a fast drawdown headed for zero emissions from fossil fuel use. That's the fast arm of this. But I will argue to you that it's equally true that we need to take fast action, immediate action, on the slower solution of perennializing the landscape to sequester carbon in the soil. We need a robust source of negative carbon emissions as a supplement and a fail-safe to drawing down emissions from fossil fuel use. If there's anything that we should have learned by now from the climate change fight and frustration, it's not to put all of our eggs in one basket, even if that basket is the size of the whole fossil fuel economy, and drawing it down. In other words, we need to keep the hashtag keep it in the ground, and we need to add a hashtag put it in the ground. Well, we know with a very high degree of confidence that soil carbon sequestration is maximized under long-term stands of diverse perennial vegetation. And we have some reason to believe that the best annual systems, the best things we can do with our current grain crops, are not just in second place, but they're a distant second place. It doesn't mean things like no-till aren't valuable, but they're probably a distant second place to what we can achieve under perennials. And so the biggest single obstacle to perennializing our agriculture and our landscape, the missing puzzle piece, is the lack of fully developed options for perennial grain crops. Now, it's true and it's vital that with changes to our food system, with eating a more decent amount of meat, which is to say a lot less, that we can retire some of our current annual grain crop acreage, and we can convert it immediately to the perennials that we already have: permanent pasture and rangeland, revegetated prairie and forest. But stopping there would be like proposing that we cut some fossil fuel emissions. It's out of step with everything we've learned at this point about the climate emergency. And so a truly serious soil carbon sequestration effort, a negative emissions response to climate change, would seek to perennialize nearly all of the 70% of our current cropland that's in grains, pulses, and oilseeds right now. A truly serious approach would be to develop perennial grain polycultures. Now, I want to check in here because it's, uncertainty is a message we're bombarded with, and I think we can argue we have plenty of actionable certainty on sequestering carbon with perennials, but we'll check in. So the science is solid, but what if some kind of swarm of runaway nanobots changes everything about soil carbon dynamics, right? And all carbon bets are off. Well, in that scenario, if we've invested in perennial grain crops, I guess we'll have to find a way to be content with how we just drastically cut down on soil erosion and water pollution and reduced our reliance on fertilizers and pesticides and massively improved our soil health. Boy, we'll be embarrassed. So with Kernza and with perennial rice taking baby steps into production, we now have proof of concept that such a thing as a perennial grain crop is possible. And as we improve our capacity here at the Land Institute, and as importantly we add collaborators around the globe, this work is accelerating. But even at this rate, full implementation is still decades away. And so I'm going to introduce a factoid here. The current global financial outlay for breeding perennial grain crops, us and all our collaborators, is by one estimate 0.1% of the funding devoted to breeding annuals. It's true that there's no level of resources that would make perennial polycultures a snap-your-fingers quick fix. But a higher level of funding for this evolving global research coalition could cut years and years and years off the timeline to perennialize our agriculture. So that's why, in addition to immediate action to draw fossil fuel emissions down to zero, we need immediate and decisive action from government and from civil society alike to support perennialization. One piece of that is that we can grass down everything we can grass down right now, pasture and range land and prairies. The other side is that we need to fully fund an aggressive global perennial polyculture grain crop research initiative. That's the fast action that we need to take to deliver this transformative solution as quickly as it can be delivered. We know, if we've learned any lessons from the past 30 years of confronting climate change, that the best time to start a necessary transformation is always now, not in some future time after we've checked some boxes for other things. So there's something else here. So other than the process of we're moving our biophysical levers to stop climate change, there's something else here, something beyond the biogeochemical process of carbon sequestration. The larger mistakes that we're making that got us to this point are not the mistakes of people who are intimately connected with the land. They're the mistakes of people who are swimming upstream and have been doing so for generations and centuries against a culture of alienation from the land. Amory Levins said yesterday that we need to end the age of carbon as it applies to our energy economy, and that's absolutely true. When it comes to our culture and our agriculture, we need to restart an age of carbon, an age of organic matter, an age of groundedness to the places that we live. Moving from an extractive relationship with the environment to fully assuming our duties and privileges as members of an ecosphere requires us to ask and answer a question that's sounded many times from this barn before. What does nature require of us here? Now, at this point, I'm going to, rather than relying on old Trusty over there, I'm going to crowdsource a visual aid here. So I need you to take a $1 bill out of your wallets, a US $1 bill. It's probably all you have left after buying all of Bill McKibben's books, but get them out. Do you have the collection plates ready, Rachel? Yeah. Okay, those will be started around. So I'm seeing some dollar bills out here. Turn it to the back side here, the one with the word one on it. So you'll see the Great Seal of the United States, both the obverse and the reverse here. Focus on the reverse. It's the one with the big creepy pyramid on it, the one that's topped by an all-seeing eye, and above that are the words "Annuit Septus." And between the I and those words, it's meant to be read as "Providence favors our undertakings." The words at the bottom are "Novus Ordo Seclorum," New Order of the Ages. We're a very modest people in America here. But it turns out that like anything, like any creative project, there was a first draft of this design back in 1782. Instead of any of the text that we see today in the final draft, it simply said, Deo favente perennis, God willing, everlasting. There's kind of a ring to that, don't you think? Now, 1782, I don't think that's so late that the concepts of God and nature had been fully pulled apart yet, right? So I wonder if we could be faithful to the original drafter of that concept to say natura favente perennis. And so I'll submit to you that any complete response to climate change will need the ethos of nature willing, everlasting. And so even in this time when alarm and urgency are the order of the day, for very good reason, most especially in such a time, our lessons need to start in the soil and rise from the ground up. The final paradox that I'll leave you with is panic versus calm. Don't worry, I won't leave you with it. I'll bring you back. So on the one hand, we can't afford to be unstirred by this crisis. We can't afford to indulge in any form of complacency, mental or emotional, because we can't afford inaction. Greta Thunberg says our house is on fire and we need to panic, right? On the other hand, the other arm of the paradox, we cannot afford fluttery, unfocused reactions bred of panic. We can't afford paralysis or fatalism bred of impending doom, because inaction always comes out of both of those things. So the answer is that we need to own both our panic and our calm. What I took from Greta, how I heard Greta, is that if your house is on fire, you set down what you're doing and you work quickly and effectively to put it out, right? That's precisely what we're called to do now. We have unambiguous word from the best science our civilization can muster that climate change is here and that the impacts, already large, will only increase. We need to make deliberate changes in our economic activities of an unprecedented size and do it with an unprecedented speed. The transitions ahead of us are not all going to be easy or pleasant, but what I will suggest to you is that in the most literal sense, we were born for this. Every person in this barn is the descendant of a hominid who looked across the African savanna with a watchful eye, kept an eye on his or her band, and survived. Every person in this barn is a descendant of an early human who braved famines and floods and icy land bridges, and in the process forged the most irresistible power in the history of the world, the power of community. These characteristics breed true. There may be somebody here in this barn whose ancestors stood on Lexington Green. There may be somebody here in this barn whose ancestors worked together to resist their own enslavement or the enslavement of others. Those whose ancestors marched with Gandhi in Gujarat, whose ancestors stood up at Selma, at Seattle, at Standing Rock, in a household against a domestic abuser. The blood in your veins is your bequest from generation after generation of people who faced the worst, turned panic into focus, and anxiety into community and prevailed. We were born for this. And so we know that if we pull this great transition off, when we pull this great transition off, we know that the qualities that we needed to make it, groundedness in the land and groundedness in community, are the same qualities that we need to make and sustain a life truly worth living. Natura favente perennis. So I've got a story. It's against our code of conduct here not to end with a story. And it's about hay. It's one of those stories that's about hay. I spent a lot of time on the home farm growing up baling straw, and I helped on quite a few occasions help neighbors bale hay. But the cows were gone by the time I was a few years old, and so my only memory of haying on our family farm is really just a 4 or 5 year old snapshot memory. I have a picture of a tractor and a stacker, and there's enough of a picture I can tell what field it is. Coincidentally, it's right by the farmstead that redwood story took place on there. But my father, Rod Iutzi, who's also here with us, has related a hay story to me that took place about 10 years before my 4 or 5 year old snapshot memory, and coincidentally in the very same field. So that particular day, sometime in the mid-'70s, my father and grandfather had hay down. They had other jobs to do, and so naturally they were quite keen to get that hay up and out of the field. Uncle Ed happened to be working with them that day. Uncle Ed was really my grandmother's uncle, but to every generation he was simply Uncle Ed. And so Ed had been fully retired from his own farming for quite a while, but in recognition of the keenness to get that hay up, he was out working. So the baler went around the field, and the rack was loaded up with small square bales and unloaded, and the cycle went on. And so at the time they'd gotten a considerable way into the field, the predictable plot point of any hay story enters storm clouds, stage west. A dark line of rain scudded up, coming fast, and they were keen to get this hay out of the field. The hay rack wasn't quite full, and so they went around again. And so sprinkles started, they became heavy drops. and before the last bales had quite been lifted up onto the rack, drops became heavy rainfall. So, with their clothes getting sodden heavier and heavier, these three men eventually made it back to the buildings. Now, if anybody here has ever gotten caught out working in the rain and gotten their clothes really wet, you'll know that there's a transition where while you're still working hard, a lot of your attention is diverted from the fundamental misery of the situation. When the hard work stops, your consciousness expands and you start to become truly miserable. So in my imagination, as the tractor key went off, as the job was done, that my father and grandfather might have seemed to an outside observer to shrink just a little as the misery set in. But Uncle Ed, age 80, fully retired from farming for years, a big grin broke out on Uncle Ed's face, and he said, "I haven't been out like this in years." So I'm going to recall yesterday how my colleague Raina Dietrich described the moment that the wheat she was growing broke free of its symbolism and it became merely itself. This is, I told you, a folksy and a bucolic story because that's in our code of conduct here. But I want to break it free from its symbolism for a moment in a couple ways. One of them leads to me instructing you to put on clothes just for a moment that started out dusty and ended up soaking wet. Feel the feel of those clothes a little bit. Feel the chafe. Feel your muscles aching just a little bit. Let this story be itself. You can dry off now at this point, and we'll get back to metaphorical senses of things. The other thing I want to break us free from is the idea that we're looking for one story. This happens to be my story, the story of my family. There are many like it. We have stories from the 70s, stories from the 40s, stories from the 1840s, the 1740s. We have much to learn from those stories. We have nuggets of wisdom, fractions of solution to draw from them. But we need more than one story. We need to draw from past traditions of all kinds, to draw from the present, to draw from the stories of people who have not yet come. I am proud of where I come from, but I am even more proud of where we can all go if we're truly working together, if we truly put all of our stories together. So for us here today, friends, the rain is coming and the hay is still in the field. We've got to jump at this point. A lot rides on our full presence and our full participation and our full resolve in this moment. Now, maybe fate will be so kind as to ordain that all of our transition tasks will be pleasant. My gut tells me that some of them won't. Some of them are going to chafe and ache. We may get caught in the start of the rain, but if we can work with speed and skill, and above all, if we can bring our stories together and authentically work together, well, we haven't been out like this in years. Thank you very much.